Hello, my dear friends. I'm gonna speak today about why socialism is the superior mode of production. What I'm about to argue is rather obvious, both theoretically and empirically. However, because there's a lot of counter propaganda, especially in the economics textbooks, I thought of doing this on camera. So, why is socialism the superior mode of production? Well, from a welfare point of view, it's quite obvious that if you don't have the profit component, you just divide the fruits of the labor to the people taking part in it. So you don't have a rentier class working, deriving income just from the fact that they own shares, deriving rents essentially. But I'm not going to go in that direction. I'm not going to argue from a welfare point of view. I'm going to argue strictly from an efficiency point of view. So, what do countries need? What do people need that live in countries? Well, among other things, they need national defense. Of course, it's very easy to argue also with respect to infrastructure, with respect to access to financing, so the banks, with respect to energy, with respect to basically all the important things in an economy. But the most obvious example is the defense industry. Because if a country has resources, we live in a dangerous world, the empire might come and get them, so a country has to defend itself. And how does the defense industry work? Well, it works on government procurement because it's not legal for any other entity to have an army except for the state. Of course, now there are also private military companies, but they also function as offshoots of the national militaries, and they only go in places where the national legislation of that country prohibits the army to go, so as that country would have plausible deniability. It is not exactly a free market, and you cannot exactly hire a private military company to do your bidding unless the country where that private military company is from agrees with it and actually has this as an interest. So the arms industry functions on state procurement. The countries are the clients, and they put out orders. In capitalist countries, in imperialist countries, such as the United States, you have the military-industrial complex, which lobbies the government and has a lot of campaign financing and a lot of financing to think tanks, which subsequently advocate for wars from which the military-industrial complex profits. And they have an incentive to milk the system. So it's not the priority of the state which is at their focus. It is the profit maximization strategy which is in their goals. So as a consequence of this, for example, the United States has been trying to create hypersonic missiles since the 2000s, since basically the same time that China, Russia, the countries on the axis of evil have tried to create hypersonic missiles. But because its economic structure is different from that of the countries on the axis of evil, the United States was not able to. It was not able to develop hypersonic missiles, but it managed to spend way more money than all the evil countries combined. Why? Because this is how the system works. This is how profit maximization works. The point is not to deliver something. The point is to rake in a lot of money and to drive the shares of the company up and to increase profitability and basically to make the owners happy, to make the rentier class happy, the capitalists who own the military-industrial complex. For them, it doesn't matter whether or not products are delivered, it doesn't matter whether or not products are good, it doesn't matter whether or not products are delivered on time, whether or not they are cost effective. what matters for the owners of the military-industrial complex is for them to have orders. And orders can also amount to feasibility studies, to all sorts of failed attempts. So, for example, the hypersonic missile program of the United States. It cost a lot of money, even though it did not deliver any hypersonic missiles, because essentially these companies function as monopolies. Okay, they're not single players in their industry. They're like 5 or 6. But as soon as they receive a tender from the government, as soon as they win a tender for the government, if it's about developing a new technology, they can take as much time as they can, because what is the US gonna do? Is it gonna buy Chinese missiles? No. It still has to rely on its domestic manufacturers in order to equip its army. And so the US is basically a captive customer to this industry. It's not an industry that it controls, rather the other way around. It's an industry that controls lawmakers through lobbying, through campaign financing and all these things. And it's not an industry that has an incentive to deliver high quality products. It is an industry that works with a profit motive. So it has the profit maximization motivation at its base. And this is why the US is the only country of its magnitude, of its military size, without hypersonic weapons. It also has to do with motives of the individual employees. So it's one thing to work for your country, like the Chinese weapons developers, the Russians weapons developers, to know that you are actually working for the defense of your country, rather than in the American case to work for a corporation, for, I don't know, Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or so on, and to know that first of all you're working in a capitalist system, so the fruits of your labor go to the shareholders, and second of all the weapons that you produce and that you might help design and innovate do not help to defend the United States, because nobody is attacking the United States on the territory of the United States. It just helps the political class, the imperialistic class in your country to wage foreign wars, to wage foreign interventions. So of course the motivation is lacking. When your country is on the line and when you actually have to defend your country, you have a different motivation to innovate, rather than when you're doing it in a profit maximization context for the shareholders. So my argument is that even on a theoretical basis, but also on an empirical basis, it is quite obvious that socialism is the better system. Because, for example, it made China the largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity since 2016. So it's been 10 years now that China has been the largest economy on the planet, given that in the 1970s it was still relying on food aid. It was still a recipient from the United Nations World Food Program of food aid, so it was food insufficient. And now it is not only the largest economy on Earth, but also the biggest innovator on the planet, has the best universities, best technologies in most fields, and so on. And this in a catch-up process of 40 years. So ever since the reforms of Deng Xiaoping opened some coastal cities to American investment, to foreign investment, and it started building up its capital base and then moving up the value chain, China has managed to surpass the West in just 4 decades. Obviously, the system was better, so I cannot ascribe this success to any other thing. It's not because of the race, it's not because of the color, it's because of the system. Because the system was held together and it was planned by the party. The state kept hold of the infrastructure and developed it. And it even created its economic champions, its capitalist champions, by using state infrastructure in terms of energy production, in terms of financing, All the important things in an economy are owned by the state, are planned in the 5-year plans, and they develop coherently, having national development as an objective in itself, and not the profit motive of individual capitalists. And this is what made China the country that it is today. And were it not for China's strategy to open up to the United States, it would not have managed to persuade the US to leave it alone to develop. So the US has started this encroaching strategy upon China for the past 10 years. It has started it basically around the time when China surpassed the United States in terms of GDP at purchasing power parity. This is when the Americans started panicking, and they started to have this belligerent view on China, to engage in hybrid warfare against China, to try to choke its energy inputs that China relies on from outside. But until then, China was left alone, and it managed to persuade the United States to leave it alone by allowing the capitalist class in the United States to outsource production, to outsource manufacturing to the Chinese labor force, and thus to increase its profitability. So the manufacturing sector of the United States managed to offer higher returns to the shareholders by moving production to a country of cheaper labor. This was the mechanism, and therefore China essentially co-opted a significant part of the American capitalist class in order to be allowed to pursue its development without economic sanctions. Because what the US generally does is that the US, as soon as a country goes socialist, the US imposes sanctions, and those sanctions do not amount just to the fact that American entities are not allowed to deal with that country. It also amounts to the fact that that country cannot process international payments, even though the counterpart would be somebody from a different country than the United States, because the financial infrastructure was designed in such a way after the Second World War that all payments had to have some sort of counterparts in American banks. And so every bank had to have a counterpart in an American bank, and every transaction had to flow through the American banking system, and therefore it was liable to sanctions. So the Treasury, being mandated to enact these sanctions, was therefore mandated to stop those payments. And this is why countries that are sanctioned, like Iran, like Afghanistan, like Venezuela, like Russia, like many, many others, have these accrued funds in US banks, which are sanctioned, and they belong to those countries, but the United States does not relinquish them, because it tries to sabotage those countries, to make them poor, so as to be able to claim afterwards that socialism doesn't work. Socialism doesn't work in countries that cannot defend themselves from the United States. Yeah, sure. So once you turn to a socialist economy and the US starts bombing you, then you can say socialism didn't work because you were carpet bombed. So this is what socialism brings. Socialism brings American bombs quite rapidly after its inception. So this is why so many countries tried socialism, and it failed because the United States managed to strangle those economies and to not allow them to perform. But otherwise, the Soviet Union took Russia, the Russian Empire, the ailing Russian Empire, and turned it into a space power. The Soviet Union was the first country to put a satellite into space, to put a man into space. And then the Americans caught up with Stanley Kubrick on a movie set and pretended that they landed on the moon. But this is what socialism does. It makes any economy, because it employs the resources to the most efficient level possible. It makes every economy this tiger that within decades becomes the biggest economy on earth, that surpasses the imperialist powers. This is the force of socialism. This is why socialism was sabotaged everywhere, and this is why every country that turned socialist had to have some sort of backing, because the US would start engaging in a hybrid war against it. Of course, we here in the West do not know this because being in the imperialist camp, we get a lot of propaganda. Our economics schools, our economics textbooks are full of these pseudoscientific models that try to claim that the invisible hand of the market is the best regulator of the economy. Of course, once you question their assumptions, they become quite ridiculous. They function on supply and demand curves, which are not only continuous and smooth, but differentiable. So on all sorts of things that do not have anything to do with the real world, but they manage to create some sort of alchemy, some sort of horoscope type of pseudoscience that Western economists take as a dogma and that they teach subsequently, and maybe they give their positions about to the popular press. And this is how this whole paradigm is created in the West and is maintained, that somehow socialism doesn't work. And of course, all the socialist countries are demonized. They're the new Hitlers somehow, because the Western population was led to believe that you can only assess foreign policy and you can only assess countries by this sole criterion, whether or not they are like Hitler, the reductio ad Hitlerum principle. And therefore the neoliberal media labels countries and labels socialist leaders as the new Hitlers whenever they request and they manufacture consent for foreign interventions to topple that government and to stop socialism. So this is why until now only China broke through. Well, there were some other countries, but they remained small socialist economies because of their size, of the size of the country, and also because of the sanctions that they were subject to. But now it is no longer the case. So China is providing this alternative financial infrastructure to these countries, and you will see already it is possible to witness the economic rise of North Korea. There are now more and more travel vloggers that go there, and it's quite a laid-back regime. Foreigners are allowed to film in many places, and there's quite a lot of development. There are tourist resorts. Of course, people who are still captive in the mindset created by the popular press in the West still ingested a lot of propaganda, both regarding North Korea and regarding China. So after 2016, the United States and its media network insisted on all sorts of falsehoods regarding China, that it genocides its own population, that it has a dystopian control system put in place, something like Palantir and something like what European and American elites want for us, something like the World Economic Forum, but they try to do this projection exercise to claim that it's the Chinese doing it and not us. And yeah, generally speaking, socialist countries have received a lot of bad press because this is how the empire works. The empire has to convince its citizenry not to want socialist measures in the economy because that affects the interests of the capitalist class, and not to regard well countries that manage to develop in a socialist manner, because those countries might provide a model for the citizenry and might give them ideas in the subsequent elections, and they might vote for socialist parties, and that's not a good idea. Not to mention that the West engineered the woke culture. So ever since Occupy Wall Street and ever since the redistributive left became quite vocal, the capitalist class managed to engineer this type of false conflicts inside the proletarian class regarding all sorts of false topics like gender, like sexual orientation, like race, and to have them fight against each other on these themes, rather than to pursue their interests collectively against the capitalist class, against the class that owns owns 99% of the economy, as was the slogan under Occupy Wall Street. The 1% owns 99% of what exists. So yeah, this is what I wanted to tell you. As always, like, share, subscribe. If you like what I do, you'll find a link in the description of the channel of how to support me financially. And until next time, take care.